I was thinking that this morning.
Oh, I'll text it to you right now.
Or you
I'll
can send
text it to you right now.
Okay. Thank you, Colin. That was beautiful. Welcome, everybody. How wonderful it is to be together. We started gathering again in July, and I still feel like I'm getting used to us all being in the same place. Hello, I'm Cindy Steele, and your service leader this morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Door County, and a special welcome to those who are online and attending virtually. Thank you for spending part of your Sunday morning with all of us. Different service leaders like to begin services in different ways. Susan Leader, as we all know, loves to tell jokes, and they're wonderful jokes. Some service leaders read poetry. Sometimes I like to take stock and acknowledge growth. When I first came to Unitarian Universalism in January of 1975 in Westborough, Massachusetts, I learned about tolerance. Of course, I'd heard the word tolerance before and thought of it as mere tolerance that was afforded to someone, something, or an idea that was annoying or uncomfortable. At UU in Westborough, I learned about a concept of tolerance that was taken to a religious level that involved respect, acceptance, and understanding. I felt enlightened learning this, which brings me to today, or last week. Last Sunday, we heard a message delivered by Pay Carter, a fourth-year seminarian who I have been thinking about all week. Pay spoke to issues of disability, inclusion, and gender in the most warm and loving ways. In the 1970s and later, none of these ideas would have been discussed, much less delivered in a message from a pulpit. We have grown. I am very proud to be Unitarian Universalist at these times. Thank you for wearing your masks properly to help us all keep ourselves safe. We continue with COVID protocols. And about your donations are needed and welcome. So we have collection plates in the foyer for your convenience. During announcements and joys and concerns, Terry will come around with a microphone and will continue to hold it for you, so there's no transfer of the microphone. And after the service, conversation can happen throughout the building, not just in the gathering room. So keep talking. We want that. I don't see any new faces today. Usually I announce our custom to ask new friends to introduce themselves, but I don't think that's necessary today. But I can introduce Doc Heidi. Yes, he sits right here, our speaker today. He has spoken here many times. We all know Doc as the co-founder of Northern Sky Theater, as a brilliant and funny playwright, actor, and singer, by the wonderful and illuminating workshops he has taught, and so many other things. There is something about Doc that you may not know, and that is he continues to write plays and composes songs. He does. He continues to be on the board of Northern Sky Theater since 1997. He has been on the board of Northern Sky Theater, and we have served together all that time, for that matter. And his message today is all shall be well. At this point, I'll ask for announcements from the floor. If there are any announcements that deal with this fellowship specifically. Are there any announcements? Okay, then we'll move ahead. And I will begin the service with our opening words and chalice lighting. Let there be peace in the sky and in the atmosphere, peace in the plant world and in the forests. Let the cosmic powers be peaceful. Let all be peaceful. Let there be undiluted and fulfilling peace everywhere. Please join me in the unison affirmation, followed by the doxology, which you are invited to hum with gusto. Please say with me. We gather together to seek knowledge and wisdom, to explore freely the vast reaches of mind and spirit, to celebrate within the caring community those truths, ancient and modern, which give meaning and direction to our lives. From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of hope and faith arise. Let peace, goodwill on earth be so. In every land, by every tongue. In your order of service is listed the principal illumination that was supposed to be delivered by Helene. Oh, I'm sorry. Delivered by Helene, but she wanted to stay home today and not drive in the snow. So she will deliver that principal illumination next week. So a moment now for joys and concerns. And please be aware that we are public. We are online right now. So if you want to speak about another person, make sure, please, that you have their permission to do so. Are there any joys and concerns this morning? Okay, thank you. All right, we will move on. For our moment of quiet, let's take a moment now to set aside any worries or other thoughts that take us from this place. With a breath, let yourself be here. And now Doc's message, all will be well.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
It's so wonderful to be back here. It's been, I'm not sure, 2 or 3 years since I had the pleasure of being among you. And it's always a great joy to address such an open-minded group. I'm reminded of the old story about a fellow who was traveling somewhere he'd never been before, and he was trying to locate the Unitarian Fellowship. So he looked in the downtown area and he couldn't find it, and he looked in the suburbs and he couldn't find it, and eventually he was outside of town and he stopped a farmer and asked him if he was too far out for the Unitarian Fellowship. And we're anticipating the punchline. The farmer responded, "No one is too far out for the Unitarian Fellowship." The other story I have for you this morning is directly relevant to our talk. Someone went to a Unitarian Fellowship for the first time and said, "I don't know what kind of church that was. The only time I heard the name Jesus Christ is when the janitor fell down the stairs." So this morning, I'm counting on both your open-mindedness and your willingness to hear the word of the name Jesus Christ, because it is directly relevant to our topic, which I also think is relevant to the holiday season in which we find ourselves. I'm going to be talking this morning about the life and work of a great British mystic called Julian of Norwich. Thomas Merton, you might be familiar with, the great Trappist monk, regarded Julian and Cardinal Newman as the two greatest English theologians. The great scholar of mysticism, Evelyn Underhill, said that Julian had a genius for the infinite. And she has influenced writers from Annie Dillard to C.S. Lewis to T.S. Eliot, and I'm actually going to be talking a bit about how T.S. Eliot incorporated her ideas and writings into his work at the very end of my talk today. So she's considered a very important person in church history. She's also the first woman known to have written a book in the English language. And she's one of the handful of female mystics recognized by religious scholars. So for all those reasons, she's important, even though she lived in the 14th century. But you might be wondering why I, in particular, would be talking to you about a 14th century British mystic. And that's because my family had a very close connection to her. When I was wondering what to talk about this, in response to your invitation, my wife Jody suggested, why don't you talk about Julian? Because I'm currently writing a song about her. The song isn't finished yet. I'm hoping to we might premiere it at the Home for the Holidays show that Northern Sky is putting on right after Christmas with Karen Mall and Matt Zombrowski and myself. And the reason I'm writing a song about her, as opposed to any number of other interesting saints, is that my mother in particular was profoundly changed and affected by her. I was raised in a devout Episcopalian household, and I realize the phrase devout Episcopalian is somewhat of an oxymoron, sort of like a little bit pregnant, or jumbo shrimp. It's two words that don't seem to go together, seem to contradict each other. Not that many Episcopalians I know are really devout in a traditional sense, but my mother definitely was. And so we went to church all the time. And of course, the Episcopal Church is the American branch of the Anglican Church, which did not exist when Julian was alive. It wasn't founded until quite a bit after she passed on, so she was Catholic, but she's very much recognized and incorporated into the Anglican tradition. Late in her life, I don't know, in the late 1980s, my mother discovered to her delight that a new monastery devoted to the work of Julian of Norwich was being built in Waukesha. At this point, my parents lived up in Rhinelander. They've been up there for 20 years. And my mother got so interested in Julian's writings and so excited by the fact that this monastery was there that she persuaded my father to move from Rhinelander to Waukesha. They bought a condo 2 blocks away from this new monastery so that my mother could literally walk over there on a daily basis if she wished, so she could participate in the services. This monastery had actually been founded by someone who grew up in the same church that we grew up in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. So we had a personal family connection with this monastery as well. When I was in town visiting from California, Jody and I would go to the services, and we would go on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, and the monks would treat us to their wonderful display of cooking skills. This was a contemplative monastery, meaning it was designed around prayer and contemplation, and there was a small number of people who lived there full time. The church itself was unusual in that the sacristy, the part where the priest normally is and the altar boys, was much larger than the rest of the church. It was a very, very small area for the congregation. You had to call if you wanted to come to make sure that there was room, because there was room for like 12 people in the congregation or something, and about double that size for the monks to be in. And they were very erudite, as so many of the people in that tradition were, from my experience, and also just sweethearted and lovely. We got a chance to talk to them at some depth about lots of different topics. So that's my connection to Julian and why I'm writing a song about her, and why I thought you might find it a little bit interesting to learn about her. I in no way want to present myself as a Julian scholar or a scholar of British medieval history or anything like that, but I do have some degree of familiarity with her work, and I think it might be, of interest to us at this time of year in particular. We know very little about Julian. We are not actually positive that her name was Julian. She's called Julian of Norwich because she lived in the church of Julian of Norwich for most of her adult life. I'll get to that in a moment. There were a number of St. Julians in church history, and there was at the time she was alive, she lived from 1342 to 1416. And at the time she was alive, Norwich was the second largest city in England, second only to London. And there were many churches, and one of them was devoted to Julian of Norwich. We don't know if she had children, if she was married. We know that she survived the Black Death, which took out, scholars think, something like 1/3 of the English population, which really kind of puts our current pandemic into perspective, I think, as well as the beginning of the 100 Years' War and all sorts of other political and religious strife. So she lived in a time of great trouble. But what we know about her derives from the fact that she wrote this book I mentioned to you. Actually, she wrote 2 versions of it, a short version and a longer version, that was not published in her lifetime. It wasn't published until centuries later. and didn't really kind of come into more popular currency until the 20th century. So what she tells us in this book is that she had prayed as a youth to have an experience of being closer to Jesus and knowing the suffering of Jesus, which was a very common thing to do if you were religious during the Middle Ages. And of course, during the Middle Ages, most people were religious. This was the centerpiece of cultural and, every other type of life, as I'm sure you're aware. So it was not uncommon to pray to experience the passion of Christ. And some years later, she actually did experience this feeling like she was going to die. And at the time then, she was regretful that she has asked God to give her an experience of what it was like to die, because she was pretty young. She was 30 years old at the time. And she records that she got progressively worse over the course of 6 days. And until the point where she was literally on the brink of death, her mother was apparently there, called in a priest to deliver last rites. The priest held up a crucifix in front of her eyes and asked her to concentrate on it. And as he did, she beheld, she says, the face of Jesus and saw his wounds, and began a series of visions that lasted for the next 5 hours, between 4 in the morning and 9 in the morning. She had 15 visitations or visions or showings, as she referred to them, and another one the following night. So she had these 16 experiences where she actually interacted, she says, with God in the form of Jesus, we think. Her writing is extremely dense. First of all, she wrote in Middle English, which I don't know if any of you ever tried to read Chaucer in the original. It's the same language. She was a contemporary of Chaucer. It's very hard to read her in the original, and even in translation, it's difficult. So it's a little hard to tell sometimes, but it sounds like she was interacting with God in the form of Jesus. She was a Trinitarian, as Catholics were at that time, and most still are, believing in Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Although interestingly enough, she regarded Jesus as the mother figure in the Trinity. She refers to Jesus as our mother rather than as the Son of God, which is a fairly radical thing to do for a woman in the 14th century, at a time when you could be put to death for those kinds of heresies. But she thought Jesus had this maternal loving aspect. And in fact, that is one of the greatest revelations that she's left us, is about the loving nature of God. So we're not quite sure when this near-death experience happened, but it profoundly moved her such that she wanted to contemplate it and write about it for the rest of her life. So she may or may not have become an anchoress before these visions happened. What an anchoress means is during the Middle Ages, it was common for people who were very devout to become either anchorites if you're a guy, or anchoress if you're a woman, where you decided you were going to spend the rest of your life inside a church often, engaged in prayer and contemplation. There were also wandering hermits who went out into the world and did this, but an anchoress was a woman who decided she wanted to literally spend the rest of her life indoors in a church in prayer. And this is a dramatic event. You had to get the permission from the bishop to do it because you were never going to be able to leave again, and you had to have enough means that someone could deliver you your food. So they went through an elaborate ritual where they declared you dead, and you laid on a bier, and they covered your body with dirt and sprinkled holy water on you, and then they sealed you up inside this room. There were, we think, 3 windows, one looking outside, one looking out of the church so she could see the services, and one for her maid to bring her food. Other than that, as far as we know, she never left for the rest of her life this room in which she was. And there are some surviving documents from the Middle Ages where we know what anchoresses were expected to do, and they were supposed to be praying at least 7 times a day and so on. Julian obviously sought this out. She wanted to think about this. And so something like 20 years later, we think, she wrote out this longer version of her work that she called Showings. It's usually translated in English, if you're interested in reading it, as Revelations of Divine Love. So this is what comes down to us. It's got many chapters. As I say, it's very dense. It's very poetic, but also, it's difficult to read. but you can certainly get the sense of what she was talking about. I'm going to try to keep this shorter today than I normally do, although I'm already going on longer than I expected I was going to. Because of COVID, I have a tendency to talk too much. I'm going to try to just focus on two aspects of her most important and famous revelations. One has to do with the loving nature of God, and one has to do with her resolution of the problem of what evil is in the world. Okay? So the loving nature of God. The writings of Julian are replete with the notion that God is love, and God is nothing but love, and God has no anger, and God is not blaming us. And just to give you an example, one of her more famous revelations was this. And God showed me more, a little thing the size of a hazelnut on the palm of my hand, round like a ball. I looked at it thoughtfully and wondered, what is this? And the answer came, it is all that is made. I marveled that it continued to exist and did not suddenly disintegrate. It was so small. And again, my mind supplied the answer. It exists both now and forever because God loves it. In short, everything owes its existence to the love of God. So here she's describing how God, Jesus, showed her the entire universe in the palm of her hand, the size of a hazelnut. Apparently this comparing something to a hazelnut was fairly common in the Middle Ages. Like we might say it was the size of a golf ball. People snacked on hazelnuts a lot. When they were excavating the Globe Theater, they found hazelnuts shells all over, apparently because the people who came, ate hazelnuts during the performances. Anyway, so it was, a small thing like that. The entire universe is the size of a hazelnut, which God tells her exists because God loves it, and ever has and has before we were made. For we are all so preciously loved by God that we cannot even comprehend it. No created being can ever know how much and how sweetly and tenderly God loves them. So many pronouncements like this. And here's one that T.S. Eliot picks up on. So I'm going to read you this famous quotation. You would know our Lord's meaning in this thing. Know it well. Love was his meaning. Who showed it to you? Love. What did he show you? Love. Why did he show it? For love. Hold on to this and you will know and understand love more and more, but you will not know or learn anything else ever. So this very extreme language basically arguing that God is love, the universe is created by love, it's all love, everything's fine. Now, I think how you respond to this message probably has at least something to do with whether you, like Julian, believed in the existence of a divine being that animated the world. And since I'm addressing a group of Unitarians, I don't take that for granted that you all come from that perspective. My mother certainly did. And so for her, this was a very, very healing message. My mother had a tendency to be self-critical, I think, in her pursuit of goodness. She was very focused on trying to become a better person. And so she had a tendency to be self-critical and sometimes depressed. And this message that God did not blame us, that God was not angry at us, that God did not need to forgive us because there was no anger in God in the first place that would require forgiveness. It was this very, very thorough notion of God as love. And the monks used to talk to us about how the fundamental parable of Christianity is the prodigal son. Julian has her own version of this parable. It's not the classic one, but I'm guessing from your nods that most of you remember this from your upbringing. The prodigal son is a parable Jesus tells about how a father has two sons. One stays at home and is responsible. The other takes his fortune, goes off, squanders it. And then when he comes back, he is ashamed and is apologizing to his father and says, please just make me a servant. Before he can even complete it, his father says, no, it's so wonderful you're back. Kill the fatted calf. You're welcome back in the household. And the other brother who stayed behind and was responsible was really upset. Why are you doing this? And the father says, no, he's returned to us. This is a day for celebration. So the monks argued that this is the fundamental parable of Christianity. God is always loving. God is always welcoming us back, regardless of what we do. So, as I say, if you believe that God exists, obviously, that's a pretty powerful message if you also presume that what Julian was talking about was accurate. If you don't, I guess I would also point out this message still has value regardless, right? When I've spoken here previously, I think twice I've talked about the really interesting construct of self-compassion. There's a great deal of psychological research on this idea that a researcher at University of Texas, Kristen Neff, has been doing research on for almost 2 decades, showing that self-compassion, our ability to treat ourselves kindly and warmly and with patience, is strongly correlated with mental health. And our tendency to criticize ourselves and think that we're not enough, or be down on ourselves, or criticize ourselves and try to get something done, all that kind of stuff, actually gets in our way. And then what we really need to do is approach ourselves with the same loving kindness that a mother would approach a child who has stumbled and skinned her knee. So these two things overlap. Of course, I am of the opinion that if you were to believe in God, this would be a more powerful invocation of this idea than if you didn't, but I don't think you can just snap your fingers and believe in God if you don't. I could develop a lengthy intellectual argument on behalf of the existence of a divine being. I don't have time to this morning. And I guess I increasingly think, as I talk about these things, which I do like to talk about, that in some ways it's beside the point, because whether or not you believe that there is a divine and sacred force in the universe has more to do with personal experience than it has to do with an intellectual argument. Thomas Aquinas can trot out whatever intellectual arguments he wants. If you've experienced it, then it doesn't matter what any of your colleagues or friends say. You will never be persuaded otherwise. William James, the founder of psychology, my field, talked about this extensively in his famous book, Varieties of Religious Experience. You're not going to talk a saint out of the belief that God exists. They know it in a way that is as fundamental as they know anything else. You know, if you've ever been to Stefano's restaurant in Sheboygan, which I strongly recommend you go to if you haven't been yet, if you've ever been there, no one is ever going to convince you that Italian food cannot be tasty. Okay? You will have a life-changing experience. If you don't like Italian food, you're going to emerge thinking, wow, this is really amazing. And it doesn't matter whether there's an intellectual argument that Italian food isn't as good as some other kind of food. I think the spiritual experience is like that myself. And some of us are fortunate enough to have had spiritual experiences, and some have not. And to the extent that you are interested in this, as I say, I think it's really more of a process of opening the mind to that possibility, which has to do with getting beyond our thinking capacity. And again, I've talked about this extensively. I won't go into this in any depth today. We can talk about this on a future occasion. But increasing research in my field demonstrates that the ability to experience advanced spiritual states involves the ability to transcend what's being called symbolic consciousness, thought, what you and I call thought. If you're sitting here right now wondering what you're going to have for dinner and, you know, thinking how terrible it is that the Packers aren't playing this afternoon and which other game I'm going to watch, that's what we call thought, okay? And that is the screen that intervenes between you and the ability to experience ultimate reality, basically. And people who practice meditation and mindfulness, what that is a practice of being in the present without the mediation of thought. And the way we get rid of the mediation of thought isn't to try to banish it, but to simply notice that it's there and return our awareness to the present. So if you're wondering how to have spiritual experience, that's a good place to start. Is to decide to spend 5 minutes a week just sitting and being in the present. And when you find thought interfering, coming back to the sensate array that is displayed before you, that's what mindfulness is. So the other topic I want to talk about today is the problem of evil. Julian is famous for her addressing the problem of evil. She wrestles with this continuously. This problem has been around so long and is so prominent in the Christian tradition that it has its own name. It's called theodicy. It's the problem that Job wrestles with, and it's been traced back at least to Epicurus, who lived in the 3rd century BC. It's often presented as a paradox. How could God be simultaneously omnipotent and compassionate? Okay, Hume talks about it, Leibniz, lots of philosophers have wrestled with this problem. If God is truly omnipotent, how could he possibly have created a world in which there is so much suffering? And I know from personal experience that there's a number of people who are not able to endorse the notion that there is a sacred or divine substance to the world because of the theodicy problem. I've talked here in the past, a few years ago, about my association with the great religious scholar Huston Smith. Huston taught at MIT, Syracuse, UC Berkeley, and so on, and wrote many books, including the finest book I'm aware of on religious diversity called The World's Religions. It's still in print, even though he wrote it in the 50s. It sold millions of copies. If you're interested in learning about Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and so on in depth in a very accessible way, I'd highly recommend his book, The World's Religions. At any rate, some colleagues of mine and I at my university wanted to start a spiritualities center, and I had the idea that we might invite Huston, since I knew he was living in Berkeley, if he would lend his name to it. And he agreed to do that on the condition that once a month we would meet and invite him to our meetings and dialogue about fundamental existential and spiritual questions. And of course, this was like a dream come true because Huston was brilliant and amazing and erudite and compassionate and incredible human being. So I got to know him because every month for some years, we would invite him to a friend of mine's house, Dr. Borg, and I got to chauffeur Huston across town. He was in his 90s when this was happening, but still, cheery as a young puppy, I must say. He was just an extraordinary person. And it was fairly common in the course of these meetings for Dr. Borg's wife, Esther, who was from a Jewish background, to tell us as a group the reason she could not believe in God was because if there were a God, God allowed the Holocaust to happen, as well as any number of other tragedies that we're all fully aware of, right? How could a compassionate God exist and allow the Holocaust to happen? So the fact of suffering, from her mind and many people's minds, contradicts the notion that there could be such a thing as a divine force. Okay. And it was interesting what Huston would respond to this. He responded in different ways, but one time he responded in a way I remember because I had been writing a show on hunting called Guys and Does that some of you may have seen. And so I was very interested in hunting metaphors. What Huston said was the original word in Greek for sin is hamartia, which translates as missing the mark. It's a word that comes from archery or spear throwing, which we don't do too much anymore, but the ancient Greeks did a lot of. And if you were an archer that was trying to hit the center of a target and you missed, that was referred to as hamartia, or translated now as sin. Now, this is clearly a very different notion of the idea of sin than has been a central received view within the Judeo-Christian tradition for a very long time. Again, I don't have time to go into all this, but Augustine is pretty well known for having argued that sin was essentially our problem, that Adam and Eve, my wife pointed out it was Eve, right? This in the original story of Genesis, Eve tempts Adam with the apple or the fruit, and he eats it, and they're kicked out of heaven. And forever after, this Augustinian notion is we've been punished with the burden of original sin, and Jesus had to die to cleanse us of this, and so on. So this is a very dark idea around sin that's very much contrasted, I think, with the notion that sin might be missing the mark. Okay, we're trying to do something valuable and we don't succeed, which of course we won't because we're fallible, and we miss the mark, and that's what sin is. So, at any rate, Julian is struggling with this issue and trying to figure it out and dialoguing, she tells us, with Jesus. Again, whether you believe this is, I don't know, it's up to you. But she reports that she's having this interaction, and that at one point, Jesus says to her, sin is behovely, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And she actually repeats that at other places in her writings too. Sin is behovely. Now, this is a word I've obviously never heard of. It's a Middle English word that we don't use anymore. Perhaps Colin's familiar with it. He's shaking his head. Behovely or behoven was a word that some scholars, is often translated as necessary or needed, but I was reading the Yale theologian's writings of Dennis Turner recently, and he was talking about a better translation of behovely might be fitting. Something is behovely if it fits into the larger narrative of a story that you are telling. So in that context, for the divine answer to be that sin is behovely suggests that the story of the universe as it unfolds requires sin. It fits into the larger narrative. But all should be well, and all should be well, and all manner of things should be well, is what she is told. She's not told that all shall be well immediately or in this lifetime. I'm sorry to inform you. God did not say you shall not be tormented, you shall not be troubled, you shall not be grieved, but God said you shall not be overcome. So she talks extensively about how this isn't really a question we can answer. The more we busy ourselves to know God's secrets in this or any other thing, the further we shall be from the knowing. Okay, so it may be beyond our capacity to figure out this question. Houston used to talk about this idea. We seem to have the idea that we should understand the ways of God. And he said, an analogy might be, do we think that a squirrel ought to understand, the human mind, or do we think that our cat ought to be able to figure out, how to get a doctorate in clinical psychology? We have a relationship to the divine in the sense that a pet or an animal has to us. We have dramatically more capacity to understand things, and God presumably does as well. So, okay, so her resolution of this problem is that it fits. What does that mean? And here I'm going to depart a little from Julian just to offer you a little my perspective on this, which you can take or leave as you wish. I've always been very affected by a quote from John Keats, which he wrote in a famous letter to his brother back in the early 19th century, where he said, "Call the world, if you please, a veil of soul-making, and then you shall know the true use of the world." A veil of soul-making. This is an idea C.S. Lewis picks up on in his writings about what does that mean? What he goes on to say is that we should think of the world as essentially a spiritual school. It's an opportunity for spiritual practice. In a world like that, suffering would not be unexpected, and in fact, it would be central. And I'd like to just point out again briefly that the Eastern spiritual traditions, Buddhism and Hinduism, particularly Buddhism, rather than trying to dismiss the existence of suffering through a theodicy argument, considers suffering foundational. The first noble truth of Buddhism is life is suffering, dukkha. It's translated in different ways, but that's, commonly life is pain, life is suffering. That is the foundational assumption of Buddhism, not something to be explained away. And then the second noble truth is what causes it. It's translated in various ways, but typically as attachment or craving or something like that. We get attached to a certain outcome, including, I might point out, it's easy for many of us to get attached to the outcome or the notion that there shouldn't be suffering. Right? What's wrong with the world? How is it that there's such terrible suffering in the world, and the innocent suffer and we're suffering, and and on and on and on, that evil exists and Donald Trump could be elected. How is this possible in a world that has a benevolent God? Well, again, the Buddhist perspective would be, we start off with the notion of suffering, and the problem is that we are attached to a particular interpretation of suffering. And the way to free ourselves from this is the Eightfold Path, which involves things like right action and being kind and good to other people, and very, very centrally, of course, to meditation, which is the process we were talking about earlier of undoing this, the fact that we are, I believe, trapped inside this fog of thought most of our lives. Most of us who don't spend our lives meditating are trapped in a fog of thought, and that is a screen that prevents us from seeing reality as it might otherwise be. Okay? So So this would be, kind of the upside down version of the theodicy problem. Suffering is essential, and you would actually sort of expect it in a world that was a veil of soul making. It seems to me if God were to exist and God were trying to create a world that were designed to refine our souls, as the angel in Indulgence in Heaven says, we're here to refine our souls. If that were the case, then it would not be surprising that the stakes in this world were as high as they are. We're all going to die. I'm sure I'm not the first person to tell you that. One thing we know for absolute sure is we're going to die. The stakes are extremely high. If you view the world as a dramatic process, then, it's all going to end in that kind of finality. Does that mean that the universe is, a terrible place that we need to, give up on? Of course not. Because in our world, there is a very close association between overcoming struggle and value. The things that are most difficult to overcome are the things that are most valuable, okay? I was thinking about this morning in regard to football. Of course, I'm very disappointed the Packers aren't playing today, but I'm also glad they're getting the week off. I watch football every week. I didn't watch football when I was a kid. We actually had two religions in my household. I said I was devout Episcopalian. My mom was very devout. My dad was devoted to the religion of football. Every Sunday, go to church in the morning, and the afternoon we'd watch football. And I used to think football's violence and, results in way too many injuries and models aggression, and it's a terrible thing. So it took me many years to get on board with the value of football. And what I would argue to you is football is definitely dangerous. Virtually a game barely goes by without somebody suffering an injury, and sometimes a season-ending injury. Does that mean that the people who devised the rules of football lacked compassion? I don't think so. I think what it means is they were trying to design a game that would be really interesting to watch. And the interest generated in watching it has a lot to do with how hard it is to accomplish. If Colin will forgive me, it was occurring to me that if Colin and no one would pay to see Colin and I play a game of football. I don't know. Am I accurate about that, Colin? However, people will pay substantial sums of money to see my good friend Colin perform, conduct an orchestra in The Lion King or Hamilton or Wicked, because of the extraordinary level of accomplishment my friend Colin has as a result of very, very, arduous practice over decades, right? So value and struggle are associated, I guess is my point. That's true of, getting a doctorate in clinical psychology was the hardest thing I ever did in my life. I'm so glad I did it when I was in my 20s. I couldn't do it now. But it was also valuable in direct relationship to how hard it was, because there was so much stuff I had to master. So I think that's the kind of world we're living in, is a world in which the stakes are extreme, in which the possibilities range, in which interpretation is wide open, but the possibilities actually eventuate in something profound, liberation, enlightenment, according to the Buddhist scholars. And again, I don't have time to go into this, but sometime maybe I'll come back and talk about very interesting research that's being done at Stanford at what's called the Center for Non-Symbolic Consciousness, in which they're studying people who are able to liberate themselves from thought, and finding that they get fundamentally transformed on their attitudes toward everything. That the entire world seems brighter, that they are no longer disturbed by emotions, that they feel like everything is fundamentally okay, even things that don't seem like they're okay. All this gets transformed as a result of the spiritual work that they're doing. Okay, so that is a path that is open to us. I think it's not one that many people are aware of. For a wide variety of reasons. This is not something, this is just the cutting edge of research at Stanford. It's just been published in the last few years. It's not been something that's been part of the empirical tradition very long, but it is there, it is real, it is a psychological phenomenon, and psychological methods are highly valued in pursuing spiritual growth. So that would be one way of interpreting what she's talking about. Sin is behoved, struggle is necessary, but in the long run, all should be well. And again, let me just lightly mention, when I was writing Belgians in Heaven, I probably talked about this before, I had to do a lot of research on the existence of heaven. And I was shocked to discover a compelling empirical literature published in some of the best journals in the world that are strongly suggestive of the existence of a soul, strongly suggestive of the existence of an afterlife. I don't think they're as persuasive as you cannot do a controlled experiment in this realm, so we have to piece it together through other means, unless Dave Studebaker wants to volunteer. We cannot do a controlled experiment about the afterlife, but we do have a shockingly large literature that's been developed over decades, strongly suggesting, again, if you're wanting to look into this, Ian Stevenson at University of Virginia devoted his life to documenting cases of apparent reincarnation that are, many of them, quite compelling. So there's a large literature on this. And I think it all comes together into a picture of the world that, to me, makes more sense than being trapped in the notion that there can't be a God because he wouldn't have allowed evil. Allowing evil is essential to the project of being in this viewpoint. Allowing people to pursue dark tasks is the same as allowing them to move toward the light. And those two things come together. They coexist. You can't have one without the other. Maybe there is a next life in which we do not struggle as much. I hope that's the case. But in this one, the refinement of our souls involves struggle, and sin is behovely. Okay. On to T.S. Eliot for our quick closer here. I don't know a lot about T.S. Eliot. I always assumed he was an atheist because of The Wasteland and things he wrote like "You are the music while the music lasts." That sounded pretty atheist to me. It turns out T.S. Eliot started off as a Unitarian. Who knew? And I didn't realize that he was originally American and then moved to England. But when he was at Harvard, he became exposed to the work of Julian. At a certain point, he was trying to figure out his spiritual outlook, and he read an essay by Bertrand Russell, who was arguing on behalf of secular humanism. T.S. Eliot decided that Russell's reasoning was shallow, and he converted to become an Anglican. And actually, a great number of his most significant poems bespeak a spiritual and religious viewpoint if you know where to look. And now that I'm aware of it, I'm finding it really fascinating, including the Four Quartets, which he considered to be his greatest poem, and which quotes Julian repeatedly, interestingly enough. So I'm just going to end with a few brief quotations from him. And maybe you'll recognize this first one from what I was reading before. Who then devised the torment? Love. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the intolerable shirt of flame, which human power cannot remove, right? Who devised the torment? Love did. A loving God created a situation in which suffering was possible, okay? Why? Well, we cannot know. Oh, hidden under the dove's wing, hidden in the turtle's breast, under the palm tree at noon, under the running water, at the still point of the turning world, oh, hidden. We will not know the answer definitively in this lifetime. And yet, as he concludes, we shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. And all shall be well. And all manner of things shall be well when the tongues of flame are enfolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one.
Thank you, Doc. That was highly enlightening and edifying. I'm so glad you were here to speak that for us. I'm reminded of words I heard quite a while ago, that the difference between a sermon and a lecture is that a sermon reminds us we're going to die. So you delivered for us this morning. Thank you. And again, anyone, if you're wanting to hang around and chat, please do so anywhere along in the fellowship where you're comfortable. The donation plates are in the foyer. For closing words, I have to say that one of my favorite songs written by Doc is from Belgians in Heaven, which he referred to in his message. And it's called Do Not Fear, Only Believe. And this is the last verse of that song. Banish your worries, for fortune has willed that earth and her heaven shall ever be filled with spirit more loving than you can conceive. Do not fear, only believe. Do not fear, only believe. Wow.
Thank you so much. I couldn't have enjoyed that more. It was wonderful. I went to a large Methodist church in Salt Lake City for 50 years, and we had Martin Ford come and give us a week's worth of lectures. Dominic Cross and West Point was there, and so I loved his books, and I loved what you had to say.
Well, thank you.
I've taken a lot of notes, and I'll go do
Well,
some
good.
research. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you for saying that.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, it is my favorite song from all the members. Just so touching and warm, and it feels so.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope you have a cozy morning.
Yes.
Thank you
And when
again.
you said all shall be well, I thought, do not really believe
Exactly.
it's the same